Good morning. I think I can safely say that we all believe that produce has a central role in the food system, and we believe that there's no doubt that produce is used by retailers centrally in their strategies. One of the things I do want to say up front, though, is one of the most valuable aspects of getting together and gathering for shows like this, for trade shows, educational sessions, is the discussion. So I might be presenting information up here, you have a question, you want to talk more deeply about the subject, please feel free to raise your hand and engage, because really I do believe that the most valuable part that we can take out of this is discussion amongst ourselves. So, okay, thank you. If we look at some of the major change drivers in the retail environment, you can see that produce has a central role in every single one of these. Rod Hawks gave a great presentation on consumer trends and the thinking behind the trends, the challenges that the industry is going through. And in almost every one of those, of course, he pointed out the role of produce. Produce is healthy. It's a leading commodity for local and organic food consumptions. And many ethnic food trends use more produce and more produce species and more produce varieties than in our traditional American cuisine. So we see the application there. It's also true that there is kind of the wrong side or the challenge in these trends for the produce industry. So it's true that produce has been implicated in food safety outbreaks in the last, especially in the last 10 years or so. On the flip side, the produce industry has engaged more and more resources putting in to reduce the risk of any further outbreaks. Again, a central role, food safety. Now, produce is also included in many of the discussions behind sustainability. So, vendor scorecards being as a contract with growers that retailers are implementing in order to improve the environment, in order to ensure safe working conditions, and in order to reduce carbon footprint. These are all under discussions, and very notably, of course, some of the most visible retailers engaging in these efforts, Whole Foods, with their extensive vendor scorecards that they have with their supply chain. In addition, Walmart has been discussing sustainability and have been working on how to include that in their own supply chains and with their own suppliers for many, many years. They were one of the first retailers to initially start these discussions. The economy, slow growth, cost of goods sales, and deflation. So this has been putting a lot of pressure on produce margins at retail. And in this era of deflation with the other commodities, you know, produce itself is still not exempt from this downward pressure. And so again, maybe on the challenging side of the trends of these drivers of change would be the impact on the produce industry. And it's supply chains, trucking uncertainty, government regulations, fuel price fluctuations, cold chain. The cold chain has been improved immensely, but then we hear, of course, that there are still issues in trucks, maybe on the production side where maybe there are issues. So still things to work on, and produce is especially susceptible, being so perishable, especially susceptible in many of these supply chain issues and drivers of change. Technology has been so important in improvements in supply chain efficiencies, and more so now we see the application of all of these mobile apps, hopefully benefiting retail sales, retail to customers, introducing new retail platforms and their ability to directly communicate with consumers and bypassing the retailer directly. So these drivers of change, definitely we see the role of produce, we see the benefits, how produce benefits these drive changers. We also see the challenges that the produce industry has in managing the drivers of change. So you've read the papers, you read the magazines, and you can see produce is a major strategy employed by retailers. It can help dollar stores, convenience stores are introducing more and more produce items to improve their margins, to create bigger market baskets for their shoppers, and to improve shopper foot traffic. It's being used by leading supermarkets in order to stay on top of the competition. And of course, Walmart has taken huge strides and is committed to improving their produce department sales. So the importance of produce, very visible, being used very strategically. And here is the dichotomy. So Amazon, major retailer, entering food, entering produce in an area where maybe we thought that we were a little safe for many years from the impact of Amazon on food and produce. We also see how retailers are trying to use produce as a defense against the entry of Amazon. So we'll be looking very closely at ways that we can use produce to be more competitive. And despite the fact that I focus on these changes as how it impacts retailers, of course, they're being felt by the industry as a whole. So produce has a central role in our food chain. And yet we see per capita consumption figures such as this graph, where per capita consumption of fruits and vegetables, and this is a graph of total fruit and total vegetable consumption, both processed and fresh, we see at best stagnant per capita consumption. So despite years of government trying to incentivize consumers to increase their consumption of healthy fruits and vegetables, despite a period where retailers have been focused on using the produce department strategically, we have not been able to budge this total consumption of fruits and vegetables. Now, on the other hand, there are some bright lights. So if you take the vegetable consumption and you break it apart, you can see in the green line is the per capita consumption for fresh vegetables excluding potatoes. You see a terrific incline in that line, but even then, by the year 2000 or so, flattening off. So, and in the processed areas, at best level, slightly declining. So we see some positive signs in individual commodities. We see some positive signs in the fresh market. However, as total consumption, we still see some challenges. And the same can be seen for fruits. We have 4 lines in this graph. Fresh, non-citrus fruit consumption is the green line, which has seen some very nice increases and still very good signs. Most of the declines, of course, are in processed. So we have a flat consumption line for total fruit. We see increases in the fresh, non-citrus consumption, which tells me that that area and those commodities are basically cannibalizing the rest of the fruit consumption. So benefits to certain commodities, certain parts of the industry, but on a whole, still seeing some challenges. So what I want to suggest that part of the solution to the retail challenges, part of the solution to perhaps to the per capita consumption challenges, is to look at our industry structure in a detailed way so we can maybe even change that. So how do you change the structure of the industry? Well, the structure is mainly the number of suppliers, the number of buyers, product flow, and barriers to entry to the industry. And yet we do see some shakeup in the industry with Amazon Fresh moving in. So I think it behooves us to take a detailed look at the structure and think about ways that we can be motivated to change this ourselves. Why should we look at this structure? Because the structure of the industry influences performance. It influences how you and your company conducts your business and how your company and the industry performs. And let me quote an article from the Harvard Business Review. So the underlying logic is that a company's strategic options are bounded by the environment. In other words, structure shapes strategy. And according to it, a firm's performance depends on its conduct, which in turn depends on basic structural factors, such as number of suppliers, number of buyers, and barriers to entry. So causality flows from the external conditions down to corporate decisions that seek to exploit those conditions. That's basically the rationale on how structure influences performance. So let's take a look on what's happening in our industry. So here's a flow chart, and fortunately you have your handout so you can look at it. If you can't see the numbers, which might be a little small on the slide, you can reference your handout. This is a structure of how product flows from the farm up to consumers. So basically we have the farm production. There are basically 4 paths it might take to move product through to the consumer. You can either export, sell to wholesalers, sell to food service, sell to retail stores. That's kind of how we've laid it out in this flow chart. In the italicized figures, those are our most current estimates of the total sales from each of those market channel members. So for instance, the farm value we've estimated for 2015 is a total of about $34 billion. As the product flows through the various market channel members to consumers, what happens? There's value added. Value added in services, value added in perhaps packaging, value added in handling, value added in repacking, value added in transportation, getting it to the right markets at the right time, so that by the time we get to consumers, there's a total value estimated of $138 billion. Now, I just want to point out a couple of things first, and then maybe we can have a little discussion around this. I might ask you a couple questions. So one of my questions is, we've estimated approximately $75 billion of produce sales from retail stores. The other major estimate is an estimate of $65 billion through food service establishments, so restaurants, hospitals, industrial. But we just heard from Rod that food away from home sales have exceeded food at home sales. So what do you think is going on here? These are produce sales. Rod was talking about total food sales. Any takers? In the retail. So produce, there is more produce being moved through retail proportionately than through food service. Is that right? So despite the many opportunities that we've seen in food service, there still is not as much produce value-wise moving through the food service sector. Any comments? We have a lot of wholesalers and distributors in the group. I know that food service is very important to you. What kind of opportunities might you see? Do you see any opportunities in increasing this food service market channel? Okay. Rod had also talked about briefly maybe most of the produce commodities sold through the food service channel tends to be the big three: tomato, onions, lettuce. As far as vegetables, this is because of the high proportion of quick service and McDonald's, fast food industry. The fine restaurants, the white tablecloth restaurants, they are the ones that are using the greater variety, the seasonal items, the local items, the imported items, the produce items that we see in many ethnic cuisines, but don't actually purchase them through the retail store. So you can see how opportunities in food service, there are many more opportunities perhaps in food service than in the retail environment so far. Okay. Now the other number that I want to point out to you is the amount of sales accounted for by the merchant wholesalers that I have written here. I have an estimate of $104 billion worth of produce sales sold by wholesalers. This includes distributors. It does include brokers. I have added brokers into there also, and wholesalers. So this is a very large number. And I would just want to say there's a little circularity and a little redundancy in this number, because in actuality, in order to get the product to the marketplace, the most difficult, you've heard about the last mile. It's more difficult getting that product the last mile. And this is where the wholesaler sector is not just serving restaurants and retail stores directly, they're also servicing the jobbers, they're servicing the smaller food safety distributor wholesaler that's actually out and getting it to the individual stores. So there is some redundancy in sales, some double counting in sales in that sector. But what I do want to point out, it's still very large and it's still very important. Any comments from the Diogo?
So from what you say there, there's really two things to consider. So one is the move from producers to either retailers or food service. The last mile, though, isn't it from retail to consumer? Right? So there's two things that, and so I think it's important. Do you have any idea of the breakdown of that? First.
Well, that's very, thank you, Diogo.
And the second thing was just thinking about what's the role of the likes of the Amazon Fresh on that? Because it might be that actually they deliver through, well, distributing really, through their channels, but they use probably some of these guys already. So it might actually increase, but that then gives a direct channel from wholesale to consumers as well. So there's really three things in here. One probably still small, but might be growing, and the other ones we don't really know the breakdown of that. It would be interesting to know, actually.
Right, and to be honest, a lot of these numbers are estimated from government figures, and the government, of course, is not tracking something like that produce movement through Amazon Fresh, or through Fresh Direct, or through some of those other places. So we don't really know officially how that is going to work, but this is an important discussion, and I wonder if some of you might be willing to share any insights you have. Peapod has known for 30 years that their market basket, the produce contained in their market basket, is as strong as retail store sales. And they have been telling us this for years. However, you know, some people haven't really believed that. And produce is supplied through, I think, some of the people in the wholesale market, at least in the Chicago area, for the Peapod, for Peapod sales. So any insights on, or any discussion on how this distribution system might be impacted, or how it might evolve as we see these players, players like Peapod, who's been around for a long time and who has chosen to use the wholesale system, and wholesalers for their picking, for their suppliers and for their picking, and how somebody like Amazon Fresh might be going in independently.
So I have more of a question, which is, if we could add the percentages of produce that's going through these, it'd be really interesting to see sort of the multipliers, the value add. You see $34 billion in farm value, translates into $1.3 billion in direct markets. But the percentage that's traveling that would be really interesting. You start to see the multiples and from a business perspective, helping drive folks to level that out maybe.
Any reactions? So one of the difficulties in some of these estimates is these estimates track sales, they don't track volumes. If you look at the food service sector, we've tracked sales, and yet cost of goods sales for food service is about 30% maybe of their total plate or sales. And for retail, its cost of goods sales is maybe 70, 72. I think Professor McLaughlin will have some numbers on that later. So even though food service sales are 65 billion, the volume that's actually being moved through there is much, much smaller than the volume moved through retail stores, just because of the markup between the two channels. Okay, I want to look at this now. This is a chart which says the same thing, but it's illustrating different things. So this chart is looking at the number of firms per stage in the industry. So from the bottom, we're looking at farms, And census estimates about a little less than 150,000 farms supplying our fresh fruits and vegetables. They're being sold, many times they're being sold through separate shippers if they don't have their own sales office or own packing sheds. They're being sold through produce wholesalers. This isn't just this is any wholesaler who sells produce. It's not the specialized fresh fruit and vegetable wholesalers, any wholesaler who is selling produce. And then I want to focus on the retail channel here. Look at this pyramid structure, and it's so evident. The number of farms, the number of shippers who are buying, the number of wholesalers who are buying. And then squeezed at the very top of that bottom pyramid is the number of chain retailers. And I say chain retailers because basically they dominate. They take, they account for the vast majority of produce sales. What happens, and then they release this product to eventually 320 million consumers. So what is the role of the chain retailer in this system? Anybody? Okay, I mean, if you're a supplier, you're thinking market power.
Well, on the retail side, they're going to play a much larger role in setting the price of what produce is going to go for and others. Because they mostly buy direct. They have their own relationships. Mm-hmm. When they have shortfalls, then they'll go to the wholesale side and they'll buy fill-in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other role that anybody can see the retail? We're going to make you run around here, over here.
Well, they're a bit gatekeepers, right? I mean, that's part of the bottleneck, right? So in a way, it's not entirely because you think you have the 600,000 stores and restaurants. So the restaurants might actually be supplied for us. So there's a bit of a loop that you are not sort of considering in here, and considering that, about 40% from what you said in the last graph is carried on through food service. There is a bit of that. But yes, so in a way, along with setting the prices, they sort of tell who has access and who's not.
Access, gatekeeper, price setting, and these are all correct. There's also the fact that these retailers, and I'm focusing on the retailers as opposed to the loop that goes to restaurants at the moment, is that these retailers, in order to take advantage of economies of scale, in order to be efficient, because they have to be efficient to operate, they have to standardize, right? So the standardization of product and assortment is just so they can manage all of the product and varieties and prices. So in other words, I don't know how many apple varieties there are, I don't know how many possible packaging, but in order for them to be able to manage their buying office and in order to manage their merchandising prices and sales out to consumers, they have to have standardization or else their mind blows, right? There's just so much out there. And when you're looking at so few retailers and when you're looking at economies of scale, they're basically constricting, I think, the assortment and possibilities that the produce industry has that they could offer. So, and as Jim alluded to, local bypasses that, or direct marketing bypasses that. And here you see how they are able to offer different varieties. They might be able to make the breakthroughs in some great tasting variety or better assortment than perhaps the chain retailers can. Any comments about that? So that there might be opportunities that retailers just cannot take advantage of. What about, we were talking about retail consolidation. What about retailer fragmentation? Has that ever been discussed much? What about the new retail formats that established retailers are experimenting with? So as retailers themselves have consolidated and become bigger and national, at the same time, you see many of these retailers trying out different formats. So perhaps being the biggest isn't the best. So they see opportunities, Be Fresh, Ahold, Delhaize, all of the various marketing or store formats that Walmart has been experimenting with. So they're looking for opportunities. They recognize what is happening in their own ability to provide consumers who are demanding more healthy, more local, more organic, more better tasting, et cetera. Okay. So we've looked at structure in two ways, in terms of product flow and sales, and in terms of firm numbers. And now we want to have a little discussion or a lot of discussion in functions or activities that people might be conducting in a single supply chain. And I want to do this and just take maybe 5 minutes. I know you can't read this on the slide very well. That's okay. You have it in your handout, and I'll break it down later. But what I want to suggest is that I want to think about ways that we can break away from some of our in-the-box thinking and break away from that box and reconstruct the structure, or at least examine some of the functions that your company performs in order to take advantage of or solve many of the issues with the supply chain or with the industry as a whole. So, and again, I want to quote that same Harvard Business Review article where it says that the ideas and actions of individual players can shape the economic and industrial landscape. In other words, a company's strategy can shape structure. This is where we have outside, an example of this is where we have the Amazons moving in. They are shaking things around, and they are changing things. So, this is a flow chart. And this is a flow chart of the functions that might be happening on the sell side in order to get the product sold to the buyer. And what I want to suggest is that if we examine not just the structure, but also some of the functions that we perform and some of the functions that our buyers perform, that maybe we can solve some of these issues. And what I want to ask now, going back, is how many suppliers do we have in the room? People who would consider themselves on the supply side. You could also be a buyer too, but if you're a supplier, it's good. Okay. So, are there areas in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, if you can you read this slide? The function areas in here? For example, here I need to take off my glasses. For instance, in sourcing, value added or processing, packaging, handling shipment, warehousing costs, selling costs, forecasting replenishment, promotions? Anything shaking up there that you've seen over the last 3 to 5 years? Has anybody been engaging in new opportunities in providing buyers with new services?
Transparency. Buyers will want to make a video of your company and want to put you on their website and link your Facebook page and really know who is producing the product.
Okay, excellent. That's a great point that I had not been thinking of. So transparency. Transparency actually is very difficult and very big, and it's hard to know how to approach it. So they've been asking for the videos, kind of proof of, examples of, for transparency, documentation.
Yeah, more like a story.
The story. To the end user. Right. Okay, so the story kind of to illustrate. Okay, which is important, and has it shaped how you have not just providing a new service, has it shaped how you have thought about reorganizing any of your own company?
Sure, I mean, it has an impact on the whole, visibility and everything, just to declare, certain growing regions, certain producers, different lots and different varieties and what that means.
Okay. Yeah, when I was in Amsterdam in one of the, and maybe it was because I was a little naive about this, but when we were in Amsterdam and looking in a warehouse, and I saw for the first time there was a case of product, tomatoes, maybe, with the person who packed that case of product, their picture was on the case. I'm not sure what that translates into. Maybe their just own internal tracking device for food safety. Not only are they identifying back to the field, they're identifying, who packed the box. Any others?
So we are growing and supplying from a more local perspective. So we're trying to cut out sourcing costs, and we also do, instead of just DC, we also do direct store delivery. So that's also on the warehousing side. And of course, the closer you are to your production, the longer shelf life you have. And in general, it looks fresher. You do notice that from customers. So there's a lot of that. We're also taking on a little bit more of the selling costs where it makes sense for us to do more of the marketing. That's much more of the branding. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. So when we can come in and do our own marketing and merchandising that doesn't have to go all the way to the store, that helps.
Great. So you're kind of taking on that responsibility, but probably learning more about what it takes to market and merchandise. Maybe? Okay. Great. Okay, so anyway, what I want you to think about is the last series of slides I'm not going to go over. It's okay, I didn't think that I would get that far. But this last series of slides, if you look at these functional areas on the sell side, and you look at the functional areas on the buy side, and this is the buy side in 3 different levels and types of buy. We have the buy side from the wholesaler or direct. We have a more integrated, I have to take off my glasses, I can't even see that far. Anyway, we have 3 different types of buying supply chains. And if you look at each one of those functional areas, I think that you can find and talk about opportunities that you can either collaborate back to your supplier, or have suppliers look at those functional areas and think about opportunities that they have in order to offer better sales, functions that they can take on themselves. And by taking on some other functions might add an additional expense on your side, but it also might improve collaborations and relationships. It might actually be a learning device for you, and it might actually get you closer, the sell side, getting closer to the consumer and understanding the consumer. So there's a lot of discussion points laid out, or that you can have on each one of those functional areas in the last few slides, if you look at them, and take them back to your company and your team and think about areas that you can perhaps improve. Okay. With that, I don't want to take any more time from the next presenter, Miguel, because he will be offering some of his research findings and insights.